boys and girls, welcome back to the podcast, to the Non-Profit Diaries, as we've decided to call this podcast now. So just quickly as well, if you can hear my older boy screaming and shouting in the background, going crazy and gobbing off, he's on the Xbox. I've told him to be quiet, but it's in one ear and out the other at the moment with that. Now that, because we're still not back to school, we're still in lockdown at the moment. And my 3-month-old, if he's going crazy, there's nothing I can do about that. It's non-negotiable with him. But the reason I mention this is, hopefully, very soon, we'll be recording this podcast from a studio, because it looks like we might have scored a premises in which to house the foundation. So that's just a little teaser. A future episode, hopefully we're taking you guys along to see where we're going to be moving into. And in our game a little bit. Anyway, so let's jump into today's episode. So today we are doing an interview on the topic of how to include commercial activities as part of a non-profit business model. So my guest today is Martyn Drake. Martyn is a speaker, writer and trusted advisor to a broad range of businesses and non-profits whose expertise includes strategy, leadership, growth, change, sales, profitability and negotiation. He's the founder of Drake Consulting, whose client list includes global household names like Weight Watchers and Walgreen Boots Alliance, and life-saving non-profits like the NHS and the National Autistic Society. He's also the author of the book which forms the basis of today's discussion, which is The Commercial Charity: How Business Thinking Can Help Non-Profits Grow Impact and Income. So, Martyn, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Danny. It's lovely to see you.
I'm just going to give people a bit of a... there we go. That's the book there, The Commercial Charity. So, £10 on Amazon, potentially make you millions for your charity. So, a bit of a no-brainer investment, if you ask me. A way to a way to sort out this, what is appearing to us to be an absolute nightmare when it comes to funding, raising money. We've got this idea for a non-profit, but what the hell do we do about it now? How do we actually make money at it? That's become the thing. So just quickly, I suppose, it's worth mentioning that the reason that I contacted you, Martyn, was because we did, it might be the episode before this one, I'm guessing now. We did an interview with Ken Burnett on fundraising. And it was an okay interview, but it didn't go the way I wanted it to. We're sort of talking past each other for the majority of it, because I sort of wanted to know how a small organisation gets going with fundraising. And he basically said that fundraising is an activity for big organisations, and big organisations that can afford to advertise fundraising. But then that's a bit of a catch-22, because how do you afford it in the first place? And so it seemed to me that we've got sort of... a couple of choices, really. Because, I mean, non-profit is by the very nature of fulfilling a role which the free market has been sort of so far unable to monetize. And so for me, for a startup non-profit to get to that point where it can afford to advertise, to fundraise, you can either get lucky with an idea that sort of captures the public imagination, or you can scrape by for years slowly, and build up to that point. Or I'm guessing you can figure out a way for the organisation to become self-sustaining. And it seems that the only way to do that is to come up with some sort of profitable business model. Would you agree with that?
Would I agree with that? The business, you're right in everything that you say. So it's the same when you're starting up any kind of enterprise, sort of small business or whatever. You can get lucky and you can land on something that really captures people's imagination in your way. And, there are plenty of examples of those, but as a percentage of the people that start businesses, it's relatively small. Yeah. Or you can drag on. But fundamentally, the similarity between starting some kind of business enterprise as a non-profit and fundraising as a non-profit is that they're both based on relationships.
Right.
So even if you're a small non-profit and you decide you want to build an income through fundraising or grants, etc., then you will need to start developing the relationships within the people who care about what you're doing in order to bring those in. And that can be done just as easily whether you're small or whether you're large. It's about, the happenstance of finding the people that are interested in what you're trying to do, who are willing to contribute from a sort of altruistic basis for fundraising, or for a sort of a return basis because they're getting something out of it as a consumer, as a customer.
Right. I think, you see, for us, it was just, we sort of, people can tell just from this podcast that we're definitely winging it with this and trying to figure it out as we're going along. That's what this whole non-profit Diaries is all about. But we're thinking part of the reason we came up with the idea for this foundation, or part of the philosophy that we wanted to underscore the foundation, the approach to it, was we've seen how sort of stodgy the process of grant funding is, where you apply to places like the National Lottery or the NHS that have got various projects. And I mean, I'm involved in a couple of applications now. One with the University of Manchester, which has been going on for like 3 years. I think it's coming up on now for one application, keeps getting sent back. It's been sent back to us about 7 times to change it and rectify it. And then was involved, both Anna and I, who running this foundation, we were involved in a charity a while back that kept applying for funding that you don't get an answer back for 6 months, a year. And so you come up with these big ideas, and then you have to wait a year to see whether you're going to get the money for it. And then often you don't get the money for it. And then you're sort of back to square one. And so we want to get away from that. So it was like, okay, we could, do a bit of fundraising. But then it's like, well, no, you can't do that either because you're too small. We might be lucky that we get, £10 here and there off people. But this idea of, thousands of donors coming in and donating and keeping the foundation going, well, that idea is out the window now. So it's like, okay, we have to come up with some sort of business idea. And so I want to sort of, I think, break today's conversations down into 3 parts, really. So one is why a non-profit should consider including commercial activities as part of a business model in the first place. Then when they have decided to do so, how to go about planning and executing on those activities. And then finally, how to make those activities sustainable, and quite importantly, for them not to get in the way of the main business, the main mission of the non-profit. So let's start with that. What would you say, what's wrong with a non-profit, and maybe you want to make a distinction between non-profit businesses, which is what we are, we're a community interest company, and a charity, which is sort of a separate entity. What's wrong with relying solely on fundraising, donations, and just people's generosity?
There's nothing wrong with it. There is nothing wrong with it at all, but it's limiting. So, you've experienced the dependency on grants means that your future is outside of your control. So you're constantly waiting for other people. A dependency on fundraising means that, and these are not necessarily bad things, they're just constraints. So if you're dependent on fundraising, that's going to constrain your ability to expand your reach. So you have a population in mind of people that you would like to help, and you can't physically help all of those people if you're dependent on fundraising, because there's never enough fundraising in the world for you to do all of the things that you want to do. Sure. So it's limited by the amount, and your focus will be half on fundraising and half on spending it. It's also really difficult for you to invest in your own organization, in taking on new people, in doing research, in doing things which don't directly deliver on the front line, because grant funders, for the vast majority of them, even individual donors, they want to see their money go to the front line. They want to see it, being delivered to the recipients, the beneficiaries, the clients, whatever nomenclature you use for it. And they don't really want it to be spent on you keeping a roof over your head, or building new systems, or doing research which they don't see contributing. And all of that's really understandable. It's kind of part of the contract of what they are giving you money for. They're giving you money for the cause, not for your organization.
Yep.
So if you have a commercial engine or aspect within your business, and you're able to generate a profit or a surplus on that, not only does it give you the ability to invest that where you want to invest it, where you think it's going to make the most difference within your organization, it allows you to scale, because if you're making money at every step of your growth curve, you're able to continue to invest in your own growth. And it also allows you to establish a market that other people want to join. And this is probably the biggest difference between the non-profit world and the commercial world is competition is not something to be too concerned about. If you're mission first, if you're creating a profitable model that delivers on your mission, then the more people that come into that market to compete with you, to copy you, the more impact that model is going to have. So yeah, you might be quite proprietary about, how much of it you want to have your name on it and how much of it you want your organization to be driving. But if you look at schools for autism, so this is an area kind of close to my heart because I've got 2 kids on the spectrum. But the National Autistic Society created the first school for children with autism. It was based on a model that Scope, or the Spastic Society as it was called then, built back in, I think, 1952. And they, both organizations, and Scope's original founders helped the NAS set up their first school. But both organizations overtly went with a model of state funding from local authorities, and sort of private funding from individuals and parents, etc., rather than trying to fundraise to run these schools, because they wanted to establish a model that was sustainable. And you look at the number of sort of special education schools there are now, there are hundreds of thousands of them in the country, well, certainly thousands of them. And there are hundreds of thousands of kids in those schools. And that model was established by those kind of pioneering non-profits who took the decision to try and create a commercially viable model. And it's expanded because they've demonstrated to be profitable. So other people, whether non-profits or whether they're sort of trusts or whether they're for-profit businesses, have now all moved into that market, and it serves a vast amount of people. But it was that first kind of non-profit decision to try and create a commercial model within that sector that would solve that problem. That catalyzed the whole of that market being born. So those are the things that you can do with commercial models that you can't really achieve with fundraising.
Do you think that there's is there any charities that maybe shouldn't engage in commercial activities, or do you think this is a sort of universally applicable, that this is something that any non-profit could turn its attention to, or is there certain circumstances where where engaging in commercial activities might be a bad idea?
I think it's probably worth sort of splitting your question up into a few different aspects. So in principle, there's no reason why you wouldn't. In practice, there are sometimes kind of challenges. So if you're dealing with particular problems in society, they may not always lend themselves to having a commercial solution. So, for example, if you want to help people claim benefits, almost by definition, those people don't have enough money to pay for your service, and taking a sort of skim off the top of their benefits once you've got them, that feels ethically quite questionable as to whether anybody could justify that. And at the same time, the authorities that they're claiming those benefits from, they're not incentivized to want to pay you to help people claim more money from them. So some might, and if there were statutory laws and rules, etc., some may have to. But generally, that's a really difficult solution to try and find a commercial model to solve. But that doesn't mean to say that you couldn't. It just means that I don't know the answer to that one. And if you could find one that works, then that's great. But there are other examples where, in sort of homelessness, for instance, the House of St. Barnabas. Are you familiar with the House of St. Barnabas?
No.
Okay. So House of St. Barnabas is a 100-plus-year, 150-year-old charity. It was originally a kind of hostel. I think it was originally for women, and then it became more sort of anybody who needed it for homeless people to be able to stay. It's a beautiful building that was left to the charity. It's in Soho Square in London. It's a gorgeous place. And they ran that as a homeless hostel for, like I said, for years, until sort of series of bits of legislation around houses of multiple occupancy and safety and those sort of things came in, and they made it increasingly difficult for them to house the numbers of people that they were housing. And also their original grants and endowments and things started to run out. So basically they couldn't make it work anymore. And I think this was in the early 2000s, it ended up closing down. And then it was reborn after about 5 or 6 years of an awful lot of thinking as a private club. So it's still a charity, but it runs now as a private club. And instead of housing homeless people, they get referrals from charities like Shelter and various and Crisis and people like that. People who have worked with homeless people who are ready to take that step through to employment. And they bring through cohorts of staff through the House of St Barnabas. So it's a members-only club, and it's members pay a membership fee, etc. They also try and attract members who are from the hospitality industry, and they train people, these cohorts of people, about a dozen, 1.5 dozen at a time, that come through, and they learn all aspects of running the club, from the kitchens to the front of house, to the bars, to the accounts, to everything. And after they've finished this program, the House of St Barnabas then uses its membership and its relationships in industry to try and place them into jobs. And it's part of a pathway that they work with their partner referral organisations, but it's a fully commercial, it's a social enterprise model. So it's all done through the operation of the bar, the clubs, the events that they do, all those sort of things. But it's part of that pipeline. So they've had to shift their model completely from being largely kind of grant dependent and local authority dependent for their funds through to being an out and out social enterprise. And it's allowed them to create a much more sustainable, it's the kind of model that could be stamped out in other cities, as long as they've got a membership and referral organisations and potentially people who will employ the graduates as they come through the programme. It's a fantastically sustainable and scalable model.
Do you think that's an argument then for maybe non-profits? I mean, it might be sort of oxymoronic, this, but for non-profits to concentrate the bulk of their activities on commercial activities, because it seems to me that there's, in considering this, when me and Anna have talked about it, and it's almost felt like, okay, it seems that what we were initially planning on doing was non-profit, and we're going to get grants and we're going to get donations, and generosity is going to fuel this thing, and our own generosity we'll be running it day to day, and that's going to be great. And that's all great in romantic fairyland when you're dreaming up these ideas. But now that the business is registered, we're about to get a premises, and things are getting real. And after the conversations with Ken and our own frustrations with actually dealing with things like not fundraising, but grant funding, the grant application process. It's when we're talking about it now, it seems like the only way to get this off the ground realistically is to engage in some sort of business activity, particularly because we're small, particularly because nobody knows who we are. We've got no staff. We're starting from scratch. So engaging in business activity is something we can get straight to doing with the very little resources we've got. But looking out into the future, it seems like that's the only way that feels secure. If we can come up with some sort of products and services to sell as part of this foundation, something that's marketable, that could keep us fueled forever. And there's something nice and reassuring about the idea that we don't have to rely on donations. We don't have to rely on the grant process. We fuel ourselves. But by virtue of doing so, it also worries me that you can become sort of too caught up in those in the commercial aspect of it and lose sight of your original mission as a non-profit. So I'll split that into a two-part question then, whether it makes more sense for non-profits to concentrate on the commercial sector. Maybe there's something about the market nowadays that makes that makes it more difficult to be a charity and makes it more viable to engage in commercial activities. But then once you're doing that, how do you stay on track and not get distracted by focusing on those products and services and forgetting about the original mission statement?
So I'll answer those two in turn. And if I forget anything, just draw me back to it. So the first point, I guess, is that these two aren't mutually exclusive. This isn't a choice that you can never revisit. So if you look at the sector as a whole, I think the National Council for Voluntary Organisations, they do a report every year, an almanac. They go through all of their annual reports from charities. And they look at how charities make money, where the income comes from, and how many volunteers this year, and all that sort of thing. And 50% of the sector's income, and this is the charities that they define as charities, so it doesn't include universities who get fees and all that sort of thing. It's pretty much the things that you and I would describe as charities. 50% of the income comes from commercial sources. It's earned income. And just under half of that is earned from local authorities and central government in terms of fees for running schools, for running services, etc. And about half of the other half of the earned income comes from either individuals or from companies paying for services. So if you look at, kind of RNIB or Age UK, those big charities, an awful lot of their income is earned from individuals, and some of them it's earned from their beneficiaries. So Age UK, a lot of the people that pay for Age UK services are older people, because older people aren't necessarily poor people, and they can subsidise the people with less money in the services that they need by providing higher value services that other people don't provide. I mean, they know their audience really well. You may have, people may have concerns about Age UK because it is a very commercial, it's a very more commercial end of the charity spectrum. But they understand older people as well as anybody, and therefore they're able to create services and things that provide real value into those older people's lives that they're willing to pay for. And that's what makes its wheels go round. So these two aren't mutually exclusive, because both of those organisations that I've mentioned, and many, many more, also have fundraising, and they also use grants. And in some ways, the grants and the fundraising can be used in the same way as you would fundraise for a business. So you go and get rounds of funding in order to power your expansion. You can get grants or social investments in order to drive your business forward. So if your idea is to begin as a social enterprise, your growth will be restricted by the amount of cash you can generate from the trade that you do. And if you want to accelerate that because you've got a proven business model and you need a cash injection, then the fact that you're a community interest company means that potentially social investment is there for you, as well as, or grants may be there for you, or philanthropy may be there for you, or venture philanthropy may be there for you, as well as your classic kind of forms of business investment. And fundraising can help you do that as well. It's really about the relationship you have with your fundraisers and what they think they're giving their money for. So these two things aren't mutually exclusive. And I'd be sad if people drew the conclusion that it's either or, because it isn't. It's not a competition, that these things are additive generally. And your second question, which is, how do you keep your focus on the mission if you're doing the business? Again, it depends on the kind of business activity you do. There's business activity which is very much driven by your mission. So if you look at the examples that I gave earlier, sort of House of St. Barnabas, its commercial activity is paying for its mission, but it's not necessarily delivering its mission in a sense. So it's provide that whole members only club provides a vehicle for them to bring homeless people through the kind of training process in order to equip them and give them not just the work skills, but the life skills to get into employment afterwards. So there is a danger in that model that you can focus too much on the club and providing the member benefits and not focusing often, because there is a slight sort of split between those two things. Whereas many organisations, in contrast, they will deliver their commercial work absolutely in line with their mission. So, for instance, if you flip back to autism, for example, if you are an autism charity and you know an awful lot about helping sort of people work with autistic children and adults with autism, etc., there's an awful lot of people in mainstream society that need to learn those skills, whether it's, a bus company or a cinema business or a hospital or, doctor's surgery, libraries, whatever, that are constantly interacting with people who are on the spectrum and would benefit from understanding how to adapt their environment so that it creates a much better experience. Banks, for instance, banks and people who are visually impaired. If you are RNIB or blind veterans or a charity working in visual impairment space, there is a commercial value to the expertise that you have in providing it to businesses and other organizations to improve the services that they can provide for your beneficiaries. And it's exactly in line usually with their mission, which is to help create a place which is, a world which better serves people with autism or people with visual impairments, etc. So depending on the kind of commercial threads you choose to follow, if they're absolutely on mission, there's never a conflict. If they're slightly off mission in terms of they're an enabler, they either create a platform or they create income, then it's more of a balancing act, and you need to judge that. But my advice would be is to, as much as possible, to try and choose, if you were thinking about developing an enterprise around your organization now, try and choose something which absolutely aligns with its aims rather than something which is a way to create money in order to deliver your aims, because that way you don't have that potential conflict.
Yeah, well, I want to delve into that a bit more specifically in a sec, but just you mentioned then it being a balancing act, and I agree that it doesn't have to be an either or. And you see, that's a trap I've sort of fallen into in just conceptualizing it, that it's the fundraising at any sort of scale is out of reach for us at the moment, and the grant application process is too frustrating, especially for, as a startup that just wants to get going. We haven't got 6 months to sit around waiting for an answer to these applications. And so it's sort of, we're sort of reacting to that by going, right, we'll forget them then, and then we'll just focus on business. And it needs to be, well, okay, but we can just do that for now, and then we can revisit these things maybe at a later date. You don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. But what I would say is, when you mention this balancing act, is and for established organisations, and particularly for startup organisations, how would you recommend they calculate that balance? For us, I'm just instinctively, I'm thinking at the moment it's probably going to serve us best to be sort of 90% on coming up with a viable business idea, and then 10 and 20% of our time we dedicate to grants and things of that nature. But how would you calculate that for different size organisations?
I think it's really hard because, particularly when you're a startup, it's difficult to work in a very planned way, because
that's a fact.
You're learning as you go.
Yeah.
This is the way that startups work, is that, you'll try stuff and stuff will work, or stuff won't work, or it'll get something will get traction in the marketplace and other things won't. So you're learning as you go, but broadly there will be pieces to your jigsaw, the pieces to the jigsaw that you're trying to build. So within your particular situation, you might be looking at some of what we want to do is around providing services or support, or funding other people to provide services or support. Some of it might be around research and learning and building up a bank of, understanding and knowledge. Some of it might be around influence. Some of it might be around creating a suite of products or services that other people working in the environment, whether you're working with people with mental health challenges and that sort of thing, it might be around products and services for those people, whether they're professionals or not. So there'll be a number of boxes that you'll want to try and start putting stuff into, and some of those will lend themselves to commercial operations and some of them won't. So for instance, it's really difficult to create a commercial business model for research.
Yes.
Unless you know that research is going to translate into something which is commercially viable. It's really difficult to do it. And if, particularly if it's a long lead time. So your research is probably going to be grant funded or, philanthropy funded or something like that. And therefore, until you can get those grants in, you're probably not going to make much progress with that. But there are other aspects around service delivery or around creating education packages that you can market and sell to other organizations, those sort of things that you can do straight away. And that balance will tip because, if you suddenly get somebody coming in and saying, yes, we'll give you a grant for this, that's where your attention is probably going to shift. It depends how many of you are in your organization, how mature you are, and what sort of infrastructure you've got. But there's a degree of agility that you're going to have to adapt to your situation in terms of, these different income streams really match different purposes within what you're trying to build. And to the extent that you're beholden to other people on grants, you're going to focus on the things that you can focus on and move forward while you're not getting grants. As soon as those grants start to come through, if they start to come through, then you'll be able to shift your focus onto those things, and to an extent you may have to.
Yeah, you see, the thing that's sort of sprang to mind for us is there's a particular form of talk therapy that me and Anna are both very familiar with, that Anna's done a lot of research in, and that we could very easily provide that as a unique service that very few other businesses even know about, let alone be able to apply it. But there's just the truth of the matter is, we wanted to engage with, the mission of the foundation is to engage with the most deprived communities in the country. People that can't access services. And there just seems something a bit off with the fact that the people that are going to be able to afford this service are, well-established businesses, sort of middle-class individuals, the very people that are already sort of well catered for by this industry. They're sort of the opposite of what our mission statement is. And I just wondered, this seems like a bit of an ethical issue with it, in that we're serving the people that don't really need us, but at the same time they're the people that are going to give us the money and the funds to be able to reach the people that we do want to get to eventually at some point. And again, that's, for me, that's another, it's an ethical balancing act rather than just a strategic one. And I'm just wondering what you would say about that, because from a pragmatic standpoint, it seems obvious. Well, of course, that money from these people is going to help you help those people. But there's still something that just gives me the ick about it. And I'm not quite sure what to do about that, whether I'm compromising my own, either compromising my own ethics or compromising the mission statement of the foundation.
So a lot of organisations run into that same challenge. And it's something that you need to work through. I can tell you my opinion on your situation, but it's probably better if I give you some examples. So the people that you're kind of describing there, they're in they're all right bracket, they've got services for them, etc. These are the people that buy the big issue.
Right.
They're not the people that need the services that the big issue provides, but they're the people that buy the big issue. If you look at, there's an awful lot of really good examples of these kind of mixed economy social enterprises if you look in the Indian subcontinent particularly. So I think it's Zika ambulances. I think I may have got that name wrong. But they provide ambulance services on a social enterprise basis for people that either can or can't afford it. And they charge depending on, I think my understanding is they charge depending on the hospital that you ask them to take you to. So if it's a private hospital, they will charge you a lot more. And if it's a poor hospital, then they will charge you an awful lot less. And if you're in severe distress and you don't look like you can pay and you're going to go to a poor hospital, they won't charge you anything. I mean, those are kind of the informal models. And there are kind of ethical questions around there, and probably ethical questions that you would have if you were in that situation. But more kind of clear-cut models are when you look in the same regions, actually, at things like eye hospitals. There are a number of really sort of famous examples in eye hospitals in India where they have 2 or 3 tiers of payment, and it's voluntary depending on you self-declare about which band you're in, whether you should pay for your eye care or whether you should get it free. And the 50% or 60% of people that pay they're the ones that subsidize all the people that get it free. And there's a couple of things that are really interesting in that. So the first thing is it's driven them to have a really, really efficient business model, because they couldn't compete with people in that mid-market paid area if they were just loading on 20-30% extra fees in order to pay for somebody else's treatment. So they've developed really efficient models within these social enterprises in order to be able to run that balance without charging much more than the market for the paid work. So that's a really interesting thing. The second really interesting thing is that they've decided not to worry about checking whether people can afford or not, because at the times they have, what they found is that it's more likely that people will say they can afford and, say that they should pay when actually they can't, than it is the other way around. It's more likely that people will lie to the system to pay out of pride rather than that they will lie to the system to avoid payment out of sort of, Scrooge, whatever it is. So those are the kind of big lessons from there, is that if you're going to cross fund one group of customers to pay for another group of customers, you need to have kind of fair market dominance so that you can afford to set prices to make that pay, or you have to have a really efficient model if you're competing with somebody else in that kind of mainstream end, which it sounds like you are. And you also have to have a model for making sure that you can select, or people can select in an equitable way, whether they get it for free or whether they have to pay for it. But if you can solve those two problems, there's absolutely no reason, there's absolutely no ethical reason why you shouldn't be able to run a service. And it will make you ask yourself questions, ethical questions like, can we guarantee that the quality of the service will be exactly the same for the people who are paying for it and the people that aren't? Can we guarantee that to the ability that which we control, the outcomes will be just as good for the people that can pay and the people that can't? Those are the questions. And if you can satisfy yourself on those answers, and that you're able to spend as much of the resources that you can generate in the top end, and if you can spend as much of those resources on those people that otherwise would not get help, then that should go some way to helping you manage your moral conflict over this.
Yeah, hopefully. Let's assume, you see, so we've got a couple of ideas for services that we can provide, and it's just sort of, I think really is just sort of that ethical hump for us to get over. But for somebody that's working in a non-profit where maybe they haven't even considered providing services for anybody before, they've been solely focused on the charitable endeavour and the services they provide within the context of the charity, and it's been based on funding that's coming in from the outside. They haven't had to rely on any sort of self-sufficient business model. And say for whatever reasons, funds are drying up. It's the amount of charities that fold every year is crazy. And so one of those organisations is thinking, I don't want to fold. We need to make ourselves market viable, self-sustainable. But we've never provided any sort of services on the free market before. Is there any standard process or thinking process to go through in order to create a product or a service out of thin air, so to speak?
There are lots of different ways to come at it. So is there a standard process? Different people will tell you that there is, but they'll all give you a different standard process. So a really good place to start, actually, if you're developing something from scratch, would be to look at something like the Lean Startup, which is, I've got a chapter in this here that's on it, but the book is originally from out of Silicon Valley, and it's how do you create a startup business with next to nothing, and it's all around iteration and agility and trying and testing and trying to prove concepts. So there are methodologies around that, but just in terms of stepping back where you are as an organisation, so you're an existing non-profit and things are starting to get really tight, and you're looking at this stuff. There are a few different ways to come at it. So number one is, do you have assets? So whether that's physical assets that you can rent out to other people, or whether that's intellectual assets. So do you have a process? Do you have expertise? in a particular area. And the second thing to ask after that is that of value to other people? Can we articulate a value case, or could we work out a value case for somebody to want to pay for that? Not necessarily the beneficiary, but maybe a third party. So if you're working in a particular area that has a social good, but the community that you're working with are not people that could pay for it directly, and what social value does that create? And are there other people that would pay for it? Are the local authorities, etc., the kind of first natural response? And, right now they're probably in a difficult position in terms of trying to find money for these sort of things, because they're overwhelmed with COVID, and then we're likely to have a massive government debt in the next few years that's going to have to be balanced somehow. But with around the local authorities and local health systems, there are commissioners, plenty of commissioners in those spaces if there's a value case for it. Or there are forms of sort of social impact bonds that you can get into, and there are intermediaries that can help you structure those things as a way to generate money from foundations and funders in order to provide social good. And a lot of that depends on, where do you think the economic value emerges from this? So most of the time when you're dealing with sort of ingrained problems, you're often dealing with poverty, and you're dealing with the impact of economics. If there's an economic benefit that you can point to, or you can start to outline from doing the work that you're doing, then that's attractive to funders within the system. So those are the kind of things to think about. And the most important thing will be who pays. Who is it? And it doesn't have to be, like I said, the beneficiaries. Most organized, the House of St. Barnabas has multiple sides to its model. One side it gives away free, another side gets paid for. And you see this in also, in advertising. So, we use Twitter and Facebook for free, almost for free. We give our data, but, we use those things for free. And other people pay for us to use that in the same way as they would with a newspaper or, a ITV or somewhere like that. In other places, in other types of commercial organizations, you have multi-sided operations where different people effectively pay for different things. So you mentioned earlier that, your eldest is playing on his Xbox at the moment. Xbox is a multi-sided model. So people buy the Xbox, but Microsoft get money from the sale of the Xbox. They also get money from licensing for the games. And in order to launch a new Xbox version, they have to keep all the games designers really sweet on board. And they also have to get the customers ready for it, because their model is based on both of those parties putting sort of certain parts of their total revenue in place. And without either one of those sides, the model will fail. So it may be that your commercial model is dependent on not just the community you're trying to support, but local authority or local businesses or whoever it is that's going to see the commercial value getting involved with you and putting some of their money in too, because they see the economic value that it'll produce that they'll benefit from. Does that make sense? So yeah. The paying customer is really critical in this. It's exactly the same as if you were setting up your own business. What is the paying customer? What is the value that they're going to get out from this? How do you articulate that? How do you engage them with that? How do you market that to them so they will pay, even if they're not the beneficiary? What is the value that they would receive? And that's got to be the basis of every commercial enterprise that you do.
Yeah, well, I mean, for us, it was sort of two ways of looking at it. Really, was one, what things do we do? What skills do we possess? Identifying those, and then saying who would benefit from them, who might be willing to pay for it. That was one perspective, so it's sort of identifying potential customers. And then the other one was not necessarily identifying potential customers, but picking sort of organisations of different natures at random, and then trying working backwards and saying what could we do for them that's part of our skill set. But then when you get to say you've got a charity that focuses on feeding the homeless. So their whole thing is they're working off donations, and they provide, say, a soup kitchen or something, and it's just homeless people come in, the food, it's volunteers, they cook the food, they hand out the food out to the homeless people, and that's pretty much the extent of it. And then during something like, COVID-19 or any other sort of economic crisis, the donations begin to dry up. When you've got an organisation like that, there's not necessarily any sort of identifiable, unique skills going on there, apart from, just pure generosity on the part of the people that are getting involved in it. There's not necessarily anything marketable there. And so for an organisation like that, where there's nothing in particular that they do that they could sell that's not already provided for by market services that already exist, do you think it's ever worthwhile for an organisation to try and expand into something it hasn't done before, strictly for the purposes of commercialising itself, trying to pluck a service out of thin air and saying, let's do that just for the sake of trying to keep things going here? Or would that be misguided?
I think that's really difficult. So you've got these three things that have to come together. So there's your mission, there's your capabilities that you've got, and there's the value that it's going to create for somebody to pay for. And ideally, you want something that fits in directly in with your mission, that plays to some unique strengths and expertise that you've got, and that delivers something that somebody's willing to pay for. You know, that's beautiful. That when that happens, that's lovely. That's, you know, you kind of your sweet spot, whatever, in the middle of those three things. But the easiest one of those three things to change or to build is your capabilities, your expertise.
Right.
So it is easiest to, you know, to develop new skills and new expertise. And to an extent, anything that you're going to do commercially, you are going to be developing new skills around it. You know, unless you're brilliant at selling and brilliant at marketing and brilliant at hosting and brilliant at you will be having to develop new skills around this sort of stuff. And that's kind of given. But it's the further away you move from the mission, the more difficult it's going to be to reconcile for yourself, the more challenges it's going to create for you in doing that. And you will end up quite often in the position where, I mean, if you look at Bellew water, for instance, you know, you familiar with Bellew
I'm
water?
not, unfortunately.
Right. So I think the idea, it was set up by a film maker called Patchett, who wanted to come up with a carbon neutral bottled water. And the idea was that they would use all the profits from the water business, from the bottled water business, to invest in water projects in places where water is really difficult to get. So, you know, your typical places, your Africas, your Indias, etc. And for years, they either lost money or they barely broke even, and investors were getting increasingly excised about this, because I think over the course of the first 4 or 5 years, they managed to generate the sum total of about 30K to use charitably. And it was only after Reed Patchett stepped to one side and brought in an external chief exec who really looked through this, that they decided that actually the charitable work was something that they should pass to somebody else, and that they should focus on running the water business, generating as much money as they could. And they covenanted all their profits across to WaterAid, which is, you know, the big water charity. So all of their money, and they're up to well over $1 million now that they've delivered. I think they're close to $1 million a year at the moment, or sort of approaching that, in terms of profit that they're then passing over to WaterAid to do all the non-profit stuff. Because the distraction of trying to do those two quite different things, to run a business which is so distinct and needs a huge amount of attention to make it work. You know, it's bottled water, for goodness sake. There's no shortage of bottled water companies. So to make that work takes an awful lot of effort. And the new chief exec, when she came in about a year after, she did an interview with the Telegraph where she talked about the time that she spent working on a dam in Rajasthan was wonderful and it was great. But she knew from, you know, 2 days of being there that actually if they'd just given the money to WaterAid, they would have run that project far better, because that's what they do. That's what they're experts at. So the danger is if you try and create a business which goes in a completely different direction just because there's a business there, you know, that's a great thing. And it's great to create a business. And if you can do that, then go for it. But the idea that that's going to sit neatly with the charitable enterprise that's tough. That is really tough, because it will pull you in two different ways. And it doesn't mean to say you shouldn't do it, but it may mean that they need to be two separate enterprises with two different people running them.
Yes, well, I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because I wonder if you think that applies the other way around and to smaller organisations. So the example you gave then is a business that was struggling with the charity side, and then they brought somebody in to focus on that. When a charity is looking to segue into a commercial enterprise, do you think it's worthwhile considering bringing somebody in specifically to do that? Because again, it's two very different animals, the free market and the non-profit sector.
There's a couple of factors to consider on that. The first one is, do you have the skills to do it? You know, we spoke a little bit earlier. You've run a business in the past, so it's not beyond your scope to think about, well, how would I set up a business? And ideally, setting up a business which is absolutely bang on your mission, which is really just finding a commercial model for doing what you want to do, rather than a fundraising reliant model. But if you decide that it's about creating a different type of business, then it still comes back to, you know, what are the skills that you've got in the organization? And the more mature you are as a non-profit and the larger you are as a non-profit, there is no correlation between that and the fact that you'll have more commercial skills. It's quite often that non-profits, big, mature, traditional non-profits, don't have a huge amount of commercial skill in there. Even the ones, dare I say it, and I dare say it because I've worked with quite a lot of them, even the ones that actually have a lot of earned income. So they will be earning income through contracts with local authorities or governments, etc. And a lot of those were grants 20 years ago, and then moved as the government moved towards the more sort of competitive outsourcing approach to social care and justice and health. An awful lot of those grants have shifted into contracts, and now those charities find themselves in a position where they are effectively commercial organisations competing on a sort of fairly regular basis. You know, these contracts are renewed every few years, etc., and they're competing with other non-profits, but also businesses. You know, the Sercos and the G4Ss, particularly in the justice sector, who want to run these services, and they don't have that kind of depth of talent, that capability. They don't certainly have the investment in developing people in order to be able to see these things as commercial activities that need a serious commercial acumen around them, to do due diligence around contracts and to do negotiations, to build really good sort of supplier customer type relationships or peer relationships with the commissioners. So because they don't do these things, they find it really difficult to actually break even on these things, and often end up cross-subsidizing them with other forms of income. And it's sad, but it's the way that an awful lot of charities have come to be, because they've not recognized this shift into the commercial world. But there are charities out there who are commercial. But even in those ones, the question that you asked, should you bring in people to do this? A lot of the time, culturally, within larger charities, it's very difficult to move people towards becoming more overtly commercial, because the barriers that you talked about, the ethical barriers, often come up. So, for example, if you're a medical research charity, you might work with a huge breadth of people who have the condition that you're researching in, whatever that may be, whether it's epilepsy or autism or whatever it is. And that's a really valuable resource in terms of, other organizations. So pharmaceutical businesses or adaptive technology businesses that want to interact with that audience, to listen to them, to find out, to get them to test things and tell them what they think. That there's a tension within a lot of those charities as to whether should we make focus groups available to these third parties who we don't necessarily know very well and we don't necessarily trust their motives, etc., in order to help them develop products that they will sell commercially to these groups. And what we often find is that there are solutions, there are ways of doing that which are ethically sustainable, that involve due diligence, and they involve contracts, and they involve limits around what's shareable and what's not, and what's endorsement and what isn't endorsement, and those sort of things. They involve a lot of pre-work to get those things in place. But they also involve a shift in mentality from the people within the organisation, because it's often the people within the organisation who are the most protective. So it's the people in your position who feel that this will be immoral that actually create this barrier, because often when you go and you talk to the beneficiaries, the people who would be in those focus groups, and you say to them, would you like to be in a focus group where you're working with adaptive technology developers to talk about technology that will be right for you. And they will ask you to try things and they will ask you to feedback on those things. Would you like that? 9 times out of 10, they will say, hell yeah, because we really need to have a voice around that table. Whereas the people in the organization feel as though that's exploiting them.
Right.
And these are the kind of challenges that you have to work through to find out, is there a solution to be able to enable this contractually or process-wise? If not, fine. But if there is, then it allows the organization to unlock value for itself and for its beneficiaries and for these third parties as well, all of which can be monetized and turned into broader service delivery or innovation or whatever it is. So there are models within this space, but it's just often it takes an awful lot of careful thought and engagement with people that you're there to support and the mission that you're trying to achieve. To think about, how can we actually go about doing this in an ethical, moral, and financially sustainable way?
Yeah. So just before we get to my final questions, which are sort of around the pitfalls that one might run into, just sort of related to what you were talking about then about mentality and attitude towards it. Do you think that it would serve a charitable organisation best to, when it comes to the commercial products that they're offering, there's sort of two ways you could do it. You could continue in the charitable frame of mind where it's like, we're a charity, but we also offer these commercial services if you'd like to take them, which is sort of very passive. Or if you're gonna segue into the free market and with commercial products and services, should you do it with the attitude that other businesses are going to, and be super ambitious and super competitive about it, and set out there to we're not just going to provide a service that happens to be in line with what we do at the charity, but we're going to provide the best service that you can get in this sector. And if we have to lay waste to every other company that's providing this service at the same time, well, tough luck. It's the free market, and all the better for it, because at the end of the day, it's serving this charity.
This is a really good question. And it's sort of got multiple aspects to it. So number one, if you're playing in a marketplace and you're not adding something, so if you're a charity and you're going into a market and what you're doing isn't meaningfully better, if it doesn't have a significantly better impact or outcome in terms of what your charity is trying to achieve, then there's no point you being there. There's no point you just being there to make up the numbers, because you won't make any money and you won't have any additional impact. So if you looked at a market and you decided that, there's loads of people producing Braille versions of books, but we're going to produce Braille versions of books because we're really interested in visual impairment and Braille, you're adding nothing to that marketplace unless you do something dramatically different. Yep. All you're doing is reducing the margins for everybody else. You're not bringing any extra impact in. You're not doing anything. So you need to believe that you're going in there to do something which is significantly better than other people are doing. The second thing is that if it's on mission, so for example, if you're an organization that works with carers, so most of us in our life at some point will become a carer. About 10% of the population right now is also a carer. So we are, dads and workers and consultants and charity leaders, but we're also carers. And what tends to happen with carers is that at certain points in that caring journey, the pressure on them from their caring perspective becomes so intense that they find it very difficult to stay in work, in full-time employment, without major adjustments being made. And so an awful lot of people who are also carers end up having to leave their jobs at periods or get under huge stress because they're trying to balance these impossible challenges together. Which means that as an employer, 10% of your staff will probably be in that position at any given moment in time.
Yeah.
So if you are ASDA or the Inland Revenue or a major employer within this country, McDonald's even, you're employing probably tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who are in that position right now. And that's probably a big driver of your staff turnover that you're not aware of. So what is that worth to you as an organization if somebody who's an expert in what carers need while they have jobs and they're going through a big need spike, how can you change your working environment and your expectations and your people management processes in order to give them the space that they need so that they don't walk out? So you've not lost 10 years of experience or 15 years of training investment that's just gone out the door because you can't flex enough. How do you see that coming? How do you put things in place? What is that worth to you as a business? Because it's worth a lot. It's worth a huge amount of money. So if you're in that situation as a non-profit, and you know, A, it's going to make a massive difference to the lives of the people that you're there to support, and B, it's going to be worth significant amount of money to the organizations who can change in order to stop wasting cash, having to re-recruit and retrain everybody, then why would you not be knocking down doors in order to have those conversations? You know, the fire for that almost sort of evangelical marketing comes from the place that what you're doing is going to have a massive impact and it provides an enormous amount of value.
Yeah.
And then why wouldn't?
Yeah, and just as a quick addendum to that, Martyn. So you were mentioning that, you know, if you haven't got an idea, product or service is particularly original, you're just sort of making up the numbers and bringing everybody else's margins down. I mean, I would argue that coming up with a USP, coming up with an original idea, original product is possibly the most difficult aspect when it comes to business. And maybe you can't come up with anything particularly original. You either haven't got the skill set or the industry you're in doesn't facilitate it. Would you still argue that it's, even though you are only making up the numbers, bringing everyone else's margins down, it's still worth doing it just to bring your margins up a bit, even if you can't think of anything particularly original? Is it still worth doing?
Generally, no.
Oh.
And the reason generally no is because if you're not bringing something to the marketplace, then you're basically playing in the commodity space. So what you're providing is something which has a known price because other people are already providing something which is pretty much the same. And they're providing it from a position of having an operation already up and running. So they've got whatever efficiencies they can get at their scale. And you're going in there at a lower scale, which means that you don't have those efficiencies. The only efficiency you have is the fact that you're prepared to put in your time for free in order to do this. You know, you could use your time in lots of other ways and donate your salary for free. So, you know, I wouldn't say if you can make money from it and you think it's reasonably sustainable and it's the best you can do and it's going to find a way to get you some money in order to do your charitable good, then don't let me talk you out of it.
Right. But
it's not sustainable because you're not going to be able to. What you really want to be thinking of is, even if this is an idea that's been done before, this is a product. What is it that you can bring to it? Is it to do with localism? Is it to do with association? Is it to do with affiliation? Is it to do with, you know, relationship? What is it that you're going to bring to it? You know, so I've seen people sell pens on eBay for hundreds of quids because they write something really funny and people bid on it because they get captivated by it, you know. So it is possible to make money from selling, you know, but it's really niche. What you want to be thinking of is, you know, from this is our mission. This is what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to, you know, get some population level outcome around mental health, for instance. Who are the people that would bring that about? Who are the people that are creating the problem for the beneficiaries, so the people that we want to support, whatever language is most comfortable for you? But who are the, you know, is it universities? Is it employers? Is it the state? Is it police? Is it parents? Is it, you know, is it home life? Is it friendship groups? You know, where are the people that need that education? And within that population, which of the ones might recognize that there is some value here for them because it will save up on crises, it will reduce costs in this, it will reduce vandalism, it will smooth over their lives, it will reduce their stress? Are there people in that whole panoply of potential customers who you think would potentially invest in the outcomes that you can help provide through the process that you use with those individuals? And if there are, that's your market. And what your market needs is you to go and speak to them and listen to them and ask them questions to try and understand what are the outcomes that they would pay for. You know, could we do a trial? You know, would you recommend this to your friends? How can you create a sort of a local business that can expand through marketing and through word of mouth, because it works, because it provides real tangible value for the people that are paying for it. So that's where, so I would, shy away from producing yet another mug with, sort of keep calm and carry on the outside, because everybody's done it. There's no margin in it. But if you can find something that absolutely hits your niche and lines up with your mission, then the world is your oyster.
Well, sorry, Martyn, I've got another. This is an addendum to the addendum question now. So I promise we're getting to the final question in a minute. But right, again, yeah. So you mentioned then about this is a question about sort of creativity and using your imagination and being experimental. And I'm just wondering to what extent you would recommend people implementing that. Because you can, like you say, you can come up with we can do mugs and pens and notepads with our charity's logo on, and that's fine. It might bring a few quid in, and also there's maybe some products and services that are standard practice for us that we could offer. But to what extent would you recommend people be experimental, and creative, and try and purposefully think outside the box, and well, just to be experimental and try out different things? Or is that going too much off a tangent and you should stick to what you know?
That's where innovation comes from. That's how you create these, unique ways of doing things. It will be from, you will have innovated. I mean, you talked about the talk therapy that you're doing. Presumably you've experimented around that and you found something which is different.
Yes.
To what other people are doing. Exactly. So you didn't do that by just conforming and doing what everybody else has done. You learned, but you did it in an area where you've got confidence, where you've got some expertise. There are other areas where you probably don't have confidence yet and you don't have expertise, but once you've done a few of these trial and tests, you will develop the expertise. So if it's an area that's close to your skill set, that it's based on your expertise and knowledge, particularly subject matter expertise, because it will be, then obviously it's I quite often do an exercise. If I have a group of chief execs or something together, say I'm doing a seminar or something, and quite often I'll give them a question. I'll give them a little mini case study, and I'll say, here's the case study. This is the organisation. This is what it does. These are the problems. What could they do? And what will happen is each little group, if I split them into groups or do them individual, they will all come up with their own single idea. They'll come up with the silver bullet that will solve this problem. And the first one that they grasp that really seems to fit the bill is the one that they'll talk about until they get it really refined. And then they'll come back and they'll say, this is the answer. And then when you go around the table, they've all got very different, this is the answers, but they're all quite certain that this is the answer until they hear the other people. And it shows you two things. The first thing is that there is no silver bullet. There's always a range of different options that you can take. So, we used to do a game with my kids when we were back when they were tolerant of me, before they became completely impatient teenagers. So I'd keep them amused by saying, give me 10 different things that you can do with a piece of paper or a brick or a balloon. And they'd have to come up with 10 different things that they could do with it. But then they got to a certain age and they will basically say, well, make 10 paper airplanes. Now can I have your phone and play on that, please? Because I'm bored with this game. And we get like that as we grow up. But you really are trying to come up with 10 different ways that we could create a business model that would solve this problem. Mm. Because the first one is the one that you're just going to want to lock into and pursue. But you have to stop and you have to look at other, because there are always lots more options. And that's the sort of second lesson, is that we get fixated on the first one. And the older we are, the less interested we are in saying, okay, so we've got one. Let's just put that aside and not talk about that anymore. Let's start from scratch and let's come up with another one. Mm. And that's really hard for people, as we get a little bit older, because we've got one. We don't need to do this. But that's the basis of creativity. That's the basis of trying to find different things that you can go out there and test and talk about, things that you could sort of pitch in a questioning way. Is this of interest? Is that of interest? What would be perfect for you when you're talking to your potential customers? Talk to me about the problem that you're trying to solve and tell me, how it feels and what would be a great outcome for you. What would ideal look like? And then you can go away with your colleagues and think about, so how could we get that to happen? What could we put in place that will give them this kind of outcome? Is that something that we could create? Because if it is, there's money there and there's impact there and it fits with our mission. So yeah, absolutely. Creativity and innovation. That's why I started by mentioning the lean startup. book. It's a really useful book. So if you don't want to read the whole book, I think it's chapter 7 or something in mine. But it's that same philosophy of iteration, innovation, trying and testing, and engaging with customers to try and find the right answer. This is where all the words like pivot and things have come from, which everybody throws about now.
I think I've said that one a couple of times this interview.
But that's the basis of it. So if you can come up with innovations, then you will be able to find solutions to these problems. If you're steering away from being innovative, it's difficult to see how you're going to find commercial viable solutions.
Yeah, and with this idea of being innovative and trialing new ideas, it's obvious when it's a hit and you've come up with a good idea, the customers are rolling in, the money's rolling in, everything's fine. But when are you flogging a dead horse? What's the time scale? What are the telltale signs that, okay, we tried this, too much effort's going into it, it's not working, we need to knock it on the head and move on to something else?
So what you're asking there about what is the innovation process? So you've got 3 broad phases to an innovation process. The first one is where you come up with your ideas. The second one is where you take them out and you try and make them work. And the third one is where you know you've got something and you can put money in and you can start to scale it up.
Yep.
So in that third phase, you've got some ideas, maybe 2 or 3, and we're going to go out and talk to customers about those and we'll see what works. And as you go through that process, you will be testing against a number of different metrics, in a sense, to see if you've got a commercially viable proposition, because it's not enough that one person says, yes, all right, then. You need to know that there is a potential market out there, that the people that you're talking to are some archetypes of a much broader population of people that will behave in a similar way. You need to prove that you can reach that population rather than just, you're going to start off with probably speaking to the people in your network, the people that you know, people that are near to you. But if you wanted to scale this business, you would have to reach people that you have no connection with, that are much further away. So what is your marketing model for that? And can you prove that it works? You have to prove that you can deliver value and you can deliver consistently and that you can convert future interest into new business. So, there's a sales process as well as a marketing process, and there's a margin that you could realize from this. So there's, 6 or 7 specific things that you would have to prove. And to give yourself time to do this, you're going to say, okay, so maybe 6-9 months, we're going to go through this and we're going to try and prove each of these things.
Right.
And when it gets to the point where we know that we can't prove it, or we can prove that we can't do it, that's the point we're going to pull the plug.
Right.
Because proving that you can't do it is every bit as useful as,
yes,
trying to prove that you can, because it means you can flip to something else instead. But there will always be new ideas, particularly if you start with a fairly creative process, you'll pick the most likely ones and run with 2 or 3 of those and then build from there.
Yeah, I think it's quite an exciting position to be in as well. And I think, like you were saying before, when it's a bigger organisation and maybe sort of less agile, there's more red tape and bureaucracy involved. It's harder for them to pivot. But for us, for a small organisation or for a startup organisation, we can sort of experiment as much as we like and try and be innovative because we haven't got a reputation to destroy yet. So it's quite exciting. Thing.
And you asked earlier on, what is what are the watch outs? What are the downsides? Or whether you said that was something you're going to come on to. And reputation is a big one. So if you look at Diabetes UK, they got an awful lot of flack from going into bed with Britvic. They did a tie-up for £500,000. And the idea was that they would, as part of this funding, they would be working with Britvic's management team and managers across Britvic and trying to educate them in terms of, obesity and sugar and all that sort of thing. And they got absolutely pilloried for it in terms of, sitting down with the devil of soft drinks. And it was a branding tie-up, but there are lots of non-profits that do that kind of brand marketing partnerships and do it really, really well. So, if I look at a lot of the environmental organizations, things like Trees for Cities, they will do partnerships with manufacturers and consumer products, etc., so that every 10 of these you buy will plant a tree, but they have really clear sort of ethical policies about who they will work with and who they won't, and what kind of companies need to tick these things. And others go much further than that. So if you look at fair trade Rainforest Alliance. I mean, fair trade, something like 80%, 90% of their income, is about 10, 12 million a year, comes from people paying to use their brand, to stick fair trade on their products. But they can only do that once they've hit a threshold in terms of their supply chain and all the things that match up with the fair trade criteria. So if Britvic had signed up to something like that with Diabetes UK to say, here is the threshold that we're going to try and achieve, and we're going to use this partnership to get us up to a certain standard, nobody would have a problem with it. Everybody, or if they proved it with another organisation, a smaller one, maybe Schweppes or Fever Tree or somebody like that that are built up to it, that they prove that we can have this relationship and that change will happen and they will get to a certain standard around sugar or obesity or whatever it is. If they proved that kind of model, at least then they would have had a stronger case. I mean, I'm a big fan of Diabetes UK because I've got a type 1 diabetic and their website is brilliant. But that was just a massive misstep because reputation is everything. But it's the worst thing is that it's actually fairly straightforward to protect.
Yes.
It's not difficult for a startup because you don't really have the reputation to worry about. You can try this stuff, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But even for large organizations, they can try this stuff. They just need to do the due diligence in advance. They need to look at other organizations that have done it, like Fairtrade, Rainforest Alliance, and Greenpeace. Look at how they do this stuff and the kind of things that they put in place to make sure they protect their reputation. And they can do it too. It's just thinking about it in advance. Yeah,
well, you've sort of masterfully reached into that rabbit hole we went down and dragged us straight back out of it. And again, we're pivoting and now we're segueing. So someone's listening to this now and they've gone, you know what? Let's have a crack at this. Let's try and come up with some products and services and get out there in the market and start selling, start bringing a bit more money in. Instinctively, what would you go, hang on a minute, before you get too excited, these are some of the pitfalls you might come up against along the way, particularly if it's particularly for smaller and new organisations, I'd say.
For smaller organisations, there are very few. The biggest pitfall is trying to do too many things at once.
Right.
So, if you focus on a couple of really good ideas and start by speaking to and particularly listening to your potential customers. So going in there, not with a pitch, but with a hell of a lot of good questions that you can ask them that will really try and draw out what is it that they would love to get that they can't get now. Those are the sort of things that will steer you, that they'll keep you on the right track. So just bear in mind, the kind of the mission, the capabilities, and where is the value going to emerge? Who is going to pay for this because they're getting value out of it? You keep those three things in mind, and you do it as a learning exercise to try and draw out from those potential customers what it is that they really, really need and what they really value. And then it's difficult to go wrong. It takes time and it takes effort. But in terms of, big cracks in the pavement that you let us fall down, there are very few for small organisations. For big organisations, it's almost always culture. It's that culture of we are a charity and I work for a charity and I didn't come here to become a salesperson. I didn't come here to be part of a business. The cultural barriers are the ones that take longest to work through. And that's about trying to find ways that you can do it that fits in with your ethics and it fits in with your morals and it does links directly to your mission. That's the be all and end all of this is the closer it links to the furtherance of your mission, the more your culture will adapt and align behind doing this commercial work. The further away it is, the more it looks like it's just a way of making money so you can pay for other stuff, as opposed to it's beneficial in itself on its own, it stands on its own 2 feet with its own impact. The more, the more it stands on its own 2 feet with impact, the more your culture will adapt and make it work. In terms of your thing, don't give up on fundraising. I appreciate, that your expert is probably an expert in fundraising for large organisations. Yes. Small organisations do raise funds. It's just that without scale, it can be really onerous.
Yes.
So if you can get the sort of grant funding, I think you're right. Don't spend too much time on it, but you keep those wheels moving, keep your ears open, that sort of thing, because when they land, they do make a big difference. But, the main thing I would encourage you to do is to just start, to try and keep it on mission, to try and make sure that the commercial stuff that you're doing is about the mental health agenda, that it's not, the whole kind of open a charity shop and then, we'll use the money from that to drive it. It's good and it works, and it gives you great profile and scope and sense and MenCap and all of those. They've got where they are today because they've got fronts, on main high streets, and that's giving them a massive public brand and that sort of thing. But it's a really hard place to start. You need scale to make it work, and it's a massive distraction. They make maybe 10% profit out of all of their turnover, even with all the goods being donated. It's a huge undertaking. So, all the things like that, where you're doing something which is off mission in order to generate money, whether it's clay pots or homemade pigeons. I don't know why I came up with that idea. Homemade pigeons.
I'll think about that one. That's thinking outside the box.
Yeah, but those things, that it's just exactly the same as trying to set up a business from scratch. And that's hard, and it's all consuming for the founders. It always is.
Yeah.
So, it's not an easier route than trying to find a sort of really kind of mission orientated one that's going to make a big difference to the people that you want to serve.
Yeah, like I said, we've got a million ideas. I mean, it's one of the other questions I had written down here, but I didn't really know how applicable it was. Is that we've got tons and tons of viable ideas, and for us, it's not a case of starting from scratch. We don't know what to do. It's what do we concentrate on, especially when you've got plenty of ideas that you think are sort of equally viable and equally exciting. So
here's what you do. What you do.
Okay.
You go through two processes. First one is you combine some of them, because what you may find is that a number of them are actually different parts of the same thing.
Right. Yeah.
So that, you might be, one thing might be around training, and another thing might be around accreditation, and another thing might be around something else. And what you find is actually that this is part of the broader package. We could build something out of this that encompasses these things or elements of them to create something that's bigger. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is, if, I use a profit impact matrix. So a little 2x2. Well, it isn't a 2x2 because the negative impact, you just kind of disappear. So you got impact on this axis, so how much impact do you think it would actually have within the population that you're aiming to serve? And that means, how much reach would it give us, and how much difference would it make to the individuals that it reaches? Broadly, multiply those two things together, that's your impact. So how much impact do you think it would give us on this axis? And is it going to make us money, or is it going to cost us money? Because charitable activities cost you money. Commercial activities make you money, and you might end up with a balance of the two things. That selling these services to middle class white students who in their 20s and don't know how lucky they are, or whatever it is, selling it to them is up here, and it's relatively low impact for you.
Yep.
But it makes good money. And then down here below the line, you've got something which is much higher impact because it's targeting the population you want to serve, but it costs you money.
Yeah.
And those two are going to have to balance. But if you get all these ideas that you got, stick them on Post-its, put a few things together, put that big chart up on your wall, and just stand there with somebody else or with a couple of other people, even do it on Zoom if you like, and say, is this one more than this one? Because you're never going to get to a scale where you go, this is 105,206 pence. It's going to be around, do you think it's bigger or smaller? And do you think this one's higher or lower? And you just get a sense of where these sit relative to each other. And then it's the stuff on the top right that you're going to go, well, let's just do that.
Yeah.
So
that's
do that.
Interesting. Yeah.
Write them out on Post-its, stick them on a piece of paper and say, which one, does this one have a bigger impact, or has the potential to have a bigger impact than this one? And does this one have the potential to make more money than this one, or will it cost more? And just stick them on a piece of paper visually and have a conversation with your colleagues around it, or your colleague.
Yeah.
About it, and just see what you think. And that will really help you narrow down very quickly. And then literally the worst thing you can do is to worry about this for too long. Best thing you can do is pick 2 or 3 and just start. Yeah,
totally agree. Yeah. There's a Seth Godin, the marketer from America. He's got a book called Ship It, which the whole philosophy behind that is, look, I think is it perfection is the enemy of the good, he says, which is a modification of the enemy of the great is the good, is it? Yeah, there's the enemy of the great is the good, which means some people don't put enough effort in and so they never achieve greatness. And his is the enemy of perfect is the enemy of the good, where you spend too much time trying to perfect something when you could just get it to good enough, ship it, get it out there, get people using it. And then when people start critiquing it and giving you the feedback, then you can start perfecting it as you go along.
Exactly. There's the whole concept of minimum viable product, isn't there? Which goes in that language along with pivot. You get something which is minimal viable product. This is as little functionality or as little perfection as it can be in order to just be viable, and then get that out there and see how people react. Because it's only when you see people using it and they talk to you about it that you actually understand what it is that people want. Steve Jobs said this years ago, doesn't it? People don't know what they want until you show them.
Yeah, totally.
A lot of the time. So, but the other Seth Godin book is Purple Cow. And that comes back to, you can't just do a knockoff of somebody else. You need something which is remarkable.
Yes. Well, Martyn, that's been very informative. Thank you for that. I feel a bit more optimistic at the end of this conversation than I did at the end of the last one, which, like I say, wasn't the fault of my guest. It was just maybe a bit of a premature interview, something that we should have done a bit later down the line when we're a bit of a bigger organisation. But there's plenty for us and hopefully other people watching this to get the teeth into there. But before I let you go, Martyn, if you'd just like to tell the viewers and the listeners, let them know about any links, projects, books, websites. Spend a few seconds just plugging away there. Let people know where they can find you.
Plug away. Obviously, being British, I'm not very good at this. There's the book. This is where I'd start. And this is the stuff that we were talking about sort of agile product development and service development, that sort of thing. It's all in there. So that would be a place to start. And as a bibliography at the end, if you just want to skim it on Amazon and then do the README and go down to the bibliography, I'm more than happy for you to do that as long as you get what you need out of it. So that will be the first place. If you go to profitonpurpose.org, that's where I put all my non-profit stuff. And I think I've got a series of webinars coming up over the next 3 months. You just email me if you want to come. Just email me and tell me, who you are and what you do, and I will send you the details, and you can join any of those calls and webinars. That's absolutely fine. Or just get in touch. Do you give out email addresses on this, Danny?
Yeah, of course. I'll anything you mention, I'll include in the description, so you can find it on the podcast stop or under the video on YouTube.
Yeah. So if you want to email me, just get in touch at martyn@binleydrake.com.
Yeah, and Binley Drake, that's your consulting firm.
That's my consulting firm. So I work.
Can't forget to plug that, Martyn. That's the profit side. That's what we're talking about. So
about 40% of my work is with businesses.
Yep.
With proper, sort of mid and large size businesses, and that's what binleydrake.com is aimed at. So that is all my corporate writing and services, etc. But all my stuff for non-profits and charities, etc., is on the profitonpurpose.org website. So if you're welcome to go to both, but what you may find is the stuff that's more meaningful for you is on the Profit on Purpose side.
Okay, perfect. As usual, I will include all those links and Martyn's email address in the description underneath the podcast or underneath the YouTube video. But in the meantime, Martyn Drake, thank you very much for joining me.
You're welcome, Danny. It was nice.